We are live on the Frugal Crafters YouTube channel. I'm Lindsay the Frugal Crafter along with Sarah.
Hello!
And we are going to work on painting rocks in watercolor. And I was so worried that I was going to title this and people would think we were painting on rocks because that's such a popular trend right now. Have you done that yet?
I haven't, but I've seen it's all over like Pinterest and Facebook and Instagram. It's kind of everywhere right now.
It is. I like the concept behind it, but I just really love the way rocks look, so I probably wouldn't paint on them myself because I just like the way that rocks look on their own, just natural. So we are going to paint this cluster of rocks. On my blog and also linked below, I have a reference photo that I took yesterday. Now it was zoomed in on my camera phone, so it's not the best quality picture, but at least you can see what the rocks look like in real life. And we are going to just be sketching and painting, and we're going to do a bunch of washes. So hopefully by the end of this, like really taking an in-depth look at a cluster of rocks, you'll feel much more comfortable at painting rocks in your own paintings, your sketchbook, or whatever you're working on. If you have questions for me about either painting on location or painting rocks or watercolor, you can ask them in the chat. We have some lovely moderators here that can help you out. If it's something that's got them stumped or something that hasn't been asked before, then Sarah will relay the question to me. So just type the word question in all caps and the rest of your question with normal upper and lower case letters so you don't get booted out. YouTube will automatically boot out like all caps for some reason, probably because it, sounds trolly. So that way we can easily pick out your questions because sometimes the chat gets going fast and we could miss one. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay, wonderful. Oh, and my watercolor course is on sale for one more week, so if you've been waiting to grab it, then I suggest doing that while it's 50% off. Okay, I am going to, this sketchbook is a wood pulp sketchbook, nothing very fancy. It's a Hannah Muley sketchbook, and I use this because this is a cheap paper in Europe. It's kind of expensive here in the United States, but if you are in Europe, you can find this really affordably. So I wanted to have something for those guys because it's difficult to find reasonably priced supplies in Europe. And this is their Cezanne paper, which is cotton. I haven't used it yet. I'm going to be using it for the first time here. I've been using a bunch of their different papers to try them out lately, and so far everything has performed very well. We're going to start with a pencil and just do a basic sketch. I'll draw it a little bit darker than I would like you to, just to make sure you can see it. And the reason I'm starting with pencil instead of pen is because we can always put in those darker accents with pen later if we want them, but we can't take them away once we put them down there. So I just try to find the basic shapes. And if I'm doing angular rocks, I make angular lines. Now, I try to make sure I have like a lot of horizontal lines if I'm doing rocks, even if I'm doing rocks in the ground, because they generally have earth around them and the earth is level. Not always, but usually, and the water will always be level. So even if you have little jut outs like that, where it goes to will end up being level unless it's going to a point. So you just want to make sure you do have those level areas so that your rocks feel flat and heavy, or anchored, I should say.
Where was this picture taken?
Webster Park in Orono, Maine. I came upon it yesterday. I have the whole story on my blog, but one of my daughters was doing a team building exercise with our high school basketball team, and I thought it was just a 2-hour program, so I brought my painting stuff thinking, oh, I'll just go sketch for a couple hours. Then I found out it was a 4-hour program, and I almost decided to go back home and work, but I decided that, you know what, I planned on sketching, I'm going to sketch. So I did. Then I treated myself to lunch at the Thai place in Orono, which is very tasty.
BC Deets, just wondering if I sign up for the watercolor course now, will I be able to do much later? I probably can't start it until the new year, but would love to take advantage of the discount.
Oh yeah, you have lifetime access. I'm always supporting in the comments and chat, so absolutely buy it while it's on sale and take it when you have the time.
Jennifer Hopping, when you splatter, how do you keep the splatters on your paper and not on the wall and chair and floor?
Well, they go everywhere, but I recommend just saving a shipping box, if you get an Amazon order or something, saving the box, and especially if you get a nice flat, if you order canvases or paper and you get one of those nice flat boxes, leave the flaps intact, set your painting inside the flat box, hold up the flap, and splatter away. and that will keep your walls clean. I don't much care. I just let the splatter fly.
Sandy LeCompte. Does Lindsay usually use water brushes or regular travel watercolor brushes when she is painting on location?
Great question. I do both. However, if I have my druthers, I use regular brushes. This is a set that I bought at the end of last year, so I got a really good deal on it at Cheap Joe's Art Stuff. It is the set of 4 pseudo sable brushes. He does have a sable set as well called like the Legend set. But honestly, this was on sale for $34, and I haven't seen it that cheap again. I think it's now $45 or $40, between $40 and $50. But they are sold out of the sets. But honestly, what I would recommend is just getting the number 12 round, which you can get on its own. And I still think it's probably about $20, so it's not cheap. But you can do everything you can do with every brush with this, because it comes to such a razor fine point that you don't need that number 4 that's in there. There's also a set I found on Amazon. The whole set was $20 that has 3 brushes, a 12, a 6, and a 2, I believe. That looks like a pretty good value, and it has mixed reviews, but any bad reviews, it seems to be like the end, the cap not fitting on the end very well, but then it's all over the place. I would suggest maybe trying that if you're on a budget, and sending them back if they don't fit well. However, if you're going to spend $20 on that set, you could also spend $20 on this one brush and know this one brush is going to do the trick. So this is a pseudo sable from Cheap Joe's Art Stuff. I highly recommend it. I'll be doing a review on this because I've been painting with it a lot, and honestly, I would have just got that one large one if I knew how well it worked. I also think I'm just going to throw in a scant horizon line here. It's going to be lower than the top rock in the middle. I'm not really going to rely on it too much, but there was kind of shoreline in the background, and the rocks were higher than the shoreline, so I just want to have that in there for my own reference. All right, and I'm using my actual travel palette so that you can kind of see how I would go about using that. Now, the one thing that is kind of a disadvantage about the travel palettes is that they usually have half pans, and like this portable painter, you can only put half pans in there. So if you are using a big brush, it can be kind of tricky to get the paint out. So what I do is just kind of try to squish my bristles together and wiggle it. The paints I have in here are core watercolors, and I squirted them in there last year, and I've gone on a couple trips with them, and and I didn't put that much in there, and I still have a lot of paint left. So so it's definitely a good paint, especially if you don't want to have to refill your palette too much. Now I'm going to start off by doing some washes on the rocks, and I am just going to start off with a very, very pale, watery down magenta. Now that is really watered down and it's still really bright, and I'm going to put them any place I see I want like the parts of the rocks to come towards me. So like on the tops, these pieces here that are kind of lower and closer to me. Then I'm going to grab some cobalt teal. Again, I'm just going to carefully get some out. If that makes you nervous to get your big brush in there, if you feel like you're going to split the bristles or damage it, you can use your round brush to get the color out, and then you can pick it up with your flat. And I'm just throwing some in there. These will mix together and give you really soft violets. Something I've really enjoyed the last couple summers is using dioxazine violet or dioxan violet in my palette. It's so good for getting those super rich, dark, cool shades. I'm going to grab a little either raw sienna or yellow ochre. I think I have raw sienna in here because it's my core palette. And those can be indistinguishable. Some use PY42 or PY43 on its own. Sometimes with a raw sienna, they'll mix something else in it. But I just try to go find a one pigment color, and I usually get, they're usually very similar or indistinguishable. I'm adding some of that in my warmer spots. That's going to tone down my magenta. And I like to do all this with a big flat brush because your flat brush is definitely going to be more rocky shaped, especially if you have a rock that's got a lot of flat faces to it. And a lot of facets. Any place where your color feels too bright, and remember we're going to be layering, so it's okay for this stage to be bright, you can go in with your yellow ochre or raw sienna. Now I'm going to grab some Dioxis Violet. This is super strong. You need to work it out on your palette and add quite a bit of water to it, or it's going to overwhelm every other color you have there. Now I think every color except for all these colors should be found in the 24 set of core watercolors. They recently came out with a half pan set, which is super cute, but you get way more paint for the same amount of money if you get the 24 5 milliliter tube set, if you were looking for the best value on these paints. But if you get the high chroma set, those probably have their most unique colors, and then you can go in with other paints you have, because they mix well with others. They're not, even though they use a different binder, they still mix with the other paints just fine. And I love how this purple just cools down and anchors my rock cluster here.
Christine, I was wondering how to show height in a painting. I took a photo standing on a cliff with a view of the water that I want to paint. How do I show that the water is below the cliffs?
Oh yeah, because that can be tricky because you're at a kind of a dynamic perspective. You need to have something in your foreground to establish that the viewer is on the cliff, and that might be a tree trunk or a bush or some weeds or flowers or something coming up into frame. So if you're on a cliff here and you want to be looking down, you want to have something coming off from the bottom of your paper that's going to establish where the viewer is. And then you want to get your horizon line in. So if you're looking down and your horizon is if you're looking down into a valley and you have a high horizon, try to find some lower area that you can put a base in, like maybe the base of a hill or the base of a mountain, and then get that kind of third dimension in there with like the edges of a hill or mountain or trees, and then get a little sliver of sky, just so you have something that will give you the depth. Also make things smaller as they get further away from you. So if you have like a bush up here or a flower up here and it's big, just have it be a little speck down in the valley, so you can show that that perspective difference. And you're going to really have to play those elements up to make it work. I also want to get some of these colors in the water. And I am just going to go ahead and with some plain water first. I want to leave a little glimmer where the water meets the rock for the little splashes, how you get that little sparkle. Now the other challenge when you're painting outside and you're using a big brush, especially if you're using the portable painter, which is what I use because I like to use real brushes, is getting your brush clean enough to go in with fresh color. So my wash here is a little tinted with that purple and magenta, but it's not really going to make a big difference, but it is something you might want to think about if you're going to be going to yellow or some other color like that. So right now I want to get some of that water in my picture, and so I'm wetting the water area. Whoops. I forgot before that I was going to be using my portable painter, and I filled up my regular water jug, so I instinctively want to go for that.
Pokey, what is a good substitute for dioxazine violet and raw sienna?
Raw sienna, use yellow ochre. Dioxazine violet, you can mix your violet using any cool red like magenta with ultramarine or another intense blue that you have. I'm going to go in with my violet. I guess I didn't need to dip into more. I had plenty there. I'm going to add a little bit close to the rocks. I'm using the chisel edge of my brush, and I'm staying with the flat brush. One key to rock painting is to use your bigger brushes and use that flat as much as you can so you don't fuss around with it too much. Now I'm going to grab some ultramarine blue. I end up running out of space, but I'll just move it up there. Try to keep it away from the red though. And I'm going to grab some sap green. I'm going to work on this back part of my palette. I think you can see that barely in frame, but I'm just basically putting on the palette so I don't have a big gob of paint on my brush, because that would be difficult to come back from. And I want to get some of that cobalt teal in there. Cobalt turquoise is a little bit earthier. So a lot of times when I paint rocks, because they can be kind of just gray and dull, is I will look for any undertones and really exploit them. Try to get as much color to show up from that. So the sky was a little cerulean, so I had a little bit of that cerulean tone in the water, so to enhance that. Instead of using cerulean, I am using the cobalt teal, which just gives it a little bit bigger of a punch. And having the green in the water shows there's lots of trees being reflected as well. And the colors will gray themselves out a little bit as you're working them around. But we start with these bright ones, so it's easy to dull it down with more glazes, but you can't really brighten it up, so we're starting bright.
Majel Nadu, what's the best way to paint in watercolor in cursive?
Oh, brush lettering. I would recommend a fairly springy pointed brush. And you actually want a smaller one than you would particularly use for painting. So like with painting, I always say go with your biggest brush. But if you're going to do brush lettering, I would say go with a smaller brush because you kind of need that fineness to make your letters. So I would probably go with like a number 4 or a number 2 pointed synthetic round, like a Taklon, something that's springy. Or try a brush pen like an Arteza or a Zig, real brush pen. Now that's getting a little dark there, and also I've got this weird area between the rock and the water, and I don't like that, so I want to either bring it up or fade it out. So I'm gonna do both. I'm gonna bring that up here, and I like to use my chisel edge against the rock so I get a nice sharp line. And then I'm also going to fade out the color. So since I know I'm going to be doing some color fading, I'm going to go ahead and put some color up there in the background. So I'm going to do some sap green to kind of indicate some foliage. Maybe even some yellow ochre. Been using green gold in my palette the last year or so. So I'm going to get some of that in there. I'm going to be removing the sap green from my palette because I have green gold and I feel like they're too similar, so I think I'm going to replace that with a hooker's green when I use this paint up. It's getting pretty low. I'm trying to get it used up so I can clean out the palette. And let's get a little bit of the magenta in there. And we are going to spray this. I'll get a little cobalt teal in there too. We're going to spray this to diffuse the color. Because I really want kind of like a loose abstract background. I want my rock in focus and I want everything else to be kind of besides the point. So I'm going to tip this and I'm going to spray and help guide my paint away. I'm going to blot some of that off with my rag. I like to do backgrounds like this because it kind of lets your eye just kind of float and imagine what's beyond there, and you're not giving it a definite object to fix on. As long as you have like a little bit of a line indicating where the horizon is, you're fine.
Erin Kimmel, my daughter used up several colors in my Koi travel palette in one fell swoop. What brand of tube paints do you recommend to refill it for use by 7-year-olds?
Well, you can get Koi by the tube. Well, it's actually by the set. I don't think you can get individual tubes, but the Winsor Newton Common would be a good solution, or Grumbacher Academy, or let's see, Van Gogh is another good one. That's a little harder to find in store. You'd probably have to go to a catalog to get that. I generally find the best prices at Jerry's Artorama, Cheap Joe's Art Stuff, or Blick Art Materials, and they sell all of those individually, and a lot of times you can use a coupon on top of it, so so you can save a little bit more, but that would be my suggestion.
Alexandra Manga, do you ever use finite paints? They look so pretty, but I don't know what to use metallics on.
Oh, I think he means Finetech, but it's probably autocorrect fixed it. I have not used Finetech paints, mainly just because I have other metallics and they're kind of expensive. But I have some cheaper ones that I use for like doing kind of like calligraphy on black paper, or like kind of toll painting flowers on black paper, or just adding highlights to watercolors. Like on my hummingbird tutorial, I used it to add a little glimmer to the feathers. So, you know, if you use it as an accent, it's very pretty, but I'd like to do that on greeting cards because if you use it as an accent on a painting and you frame it, you'll lose all the metallic when you have it behind glass.
Deborah Aceta, I know that watercolor dries lighter, but why does mine look so dull?
It could be the quality of your paints. There could have been a lot of chalk or filler in the paint, and that will make it look really dull when it dries. You'll have a big shift. So upgrading to like an artist grade paint will give you less shift between wet and dry.
Bev Robert, has Lindsay ever done a tutorial using acrylic paints as watercolor with watercolors for glazing?
I haven't, but you totally could do that. I have done a tutorial. It's a plumeria flower, and I used acrylics as watercolors. But that would be a great way to do some glazing if you had issues with your acrylics, with your watercolors lifting. The only thing to keep in mind though is that if that acrylic paint is thick, it is going to make a film on your paper and you're not going to be able to glaze because there'll be nothing to grab the watercolor. Alright. I think that's dry enough so I can work on the rocks again. This cotton paper is more absorbent, so it's going to dry slower than a wood pulp paper, but I love that dreamy soft background. Now I want to show you the difference. The reason I wanted to do this one on cotton and have the other one on wood is so that I could show you some differences between cotton and wood pulp paper. The background here on the wood pulp paper, you can see how the pigments separated a lot more on the surface, how we got a lot of like cauliflower backgrounds. I like it. I think it's kind of spontaneous and pretty, but when you do the same technique on a cotton paper, you get a much more smooth blend. So just that's just one of the differences that you'll notice when you're working on cotton versus wood pulp paper. You can still get the blooms, like you can see here, where some of that background bled into the water area, which had already started to set up. So we have a little bit of a bloom there and a little one here. If this had been wood paper, cellulose paper, you would have a much more distinct edge to the bloom. So instead of that, what you'd have is something like that. Again, I kind of like the look of those spontaneous blooms, but if that's something that you struggle with, trying a cotton paper will solve your problem. So I figured there'd be a few little things along the way like that we could compare. My paper is still a little damp, so I definitely don't want to go over the water area, but I can go in and do my next glazes on the rocks. Now, when I was painting yesterday, I did not have a 1/2-inch flat brush. That would be handy, but since I didn't have that yesterday, I think I'll just stick with my 1-inch wide one. But if you want to switch to a flat, by all means, go for it. I'm going to mix my burnt sienna and my ultramarine to make a nice gray. I'm going to do it over here in yellow ochre land because the yellow ochre won't really bother it, and that way I can free up a space. I don't want to get into the magenta at this stage. I usually don't find that. I find this to be an ample enough mixing area between these two like winged palettes when I'm out and about. In the studio, I get used to having big palettes, so or extra plates, so I tend to outgrow my surroundings pretty quickly.
D. Whitmore, would you do the background with the bright colors if you were plein air painting, or would you paint in more detail based on what you see?
It really depends. Actually, this is the second painting I had done that day. And the first day I did the first painting I did very realistic colors, but I got so overwhelmed with the colors, with the green basically. So that's why I decided to just take the rocks and do more fanciful colors. So it just depends on how I'm feeling and what the scene is saying to me. Boy, now that I have the choice of grabbing a smaller brush, I really feel like I want to be using a flat, like a 1/2-inch flat. But so if you're home, I would say go for the 1/2-inch flat. But I'm feeling like I should also just do it with the brushes that I take with me, and stick with a 1-inch. So I'm getting in these darker shadows here, and it's helping me make the facets and the planes of the rock. So I will tip my brush. If I don't have a smaller flat, I will tip my brush so that so that I'm only using like half of it, but I'm still able to get that flat edge, especially up against the bottom where it's touching the water. But I try not to have like just a plain rectangle. I try to break it up a little bit so I have some more random shapes and edges. And I'll use a chisel edge for straight lines. And this just is easier to get that hard, flat feeling of a rock than I would get with using a round brush. This is a Royal and Langnickel Espresso 1-inch wash. And their espresso line is, I believe it's a faux type of like, it's almost similar to like a mongoose. I believe it's dyed to look like a mongoose, but it definitely has a nice absorbency, but also a nice snap to it.
Teresa Gonzalez, would you use artist quality paints like Daniel Smith primary colors and mix, or use watercolors you don't have to mix?
I generally go for mixing. Like with my travel palette, I have 2 of each primary, a warm primary and a cool primary. So that's what this part of the palette is. And that's really all I absolutely need, but sometimes time is of the essence when I'm out painting, so I have some convenience colors. Yellow ochre, burnt sienna are 2 that I love to have, and sap green. But since I mentioned before I have a green gold, I'm thinking of just nixing the sap green and going with a hooker's green, or even an emerald, or phthalo green, which is a single pigment, really intense green that you can dull down with red or other colors. And just for fun, I threw in dioxazine violet and cobalt teal because they're kind of unusual colors, difficult to mix, and have fun qualities to them. But generally, yeah, mixing is your best bet, because then you won't have any oddball colors and you'll end up having greater harmony in your artwork. That Daniel Smith Essential set is really a great one to begin with. The tubes are small, but it goes a long way, and it's not crazy expensive. It's more expensive now than it was a year ago, unfortunately, but when things get popular, they jack the price up, unfortunately.
Venus Reels, I have Joy Art watercolor paints. I find they flake a lot and need paint specks on my paper. Why is that?
I would say if they're flaking, you might be applying them too thick, because I'm familiar with the Joy Art paints. I would say use your brighter colors, but add a lot of water to them so that you can get those washes. I think some of the colors are kind of opaque in that, like the flesh tint and there's a white, and I think those will definitely want to flake, especially if you're using them thickly. But I didn't have any trouble using those paints. Also, could be your paper. If your paper's too slick, maybe it's not a watercolor paper, there might not be anything for it to bond to.
Bev Roberts, what are lost and found edges?
Oh, lost and found edges are when an item is not completely outlined, and you have some hard, crisp edges, and then you have some soft, faded edges. So instead of having like an orange that is a circle that's filled in, you would have like maybe the orange, it's like 3/4 of a circle, and the rest just kind of fades away. I'll see if I have, I'll look at my sketchbook, see if I have an example of a lost and found edge. I don't know if I do. I just started this one. Well, I don't really have an example right here, but if you look at like this blade of grass here, you've got this harsh line there and there, but then it fades away over here into some other stuff. It's generally a little bit more of a subtle fade, but that's when you have lost and found edges. You have some crisp details, and then it kind of dissolves out into something else. I'm going to go back to the water, and we're going to use that flat brush again, and we're going to make kind of like a deep murky teal color. So I am going to use my cobalt teal and ultramarine, add a smidgen of violet. The violet is so transparent. It's a single pigment color, so it's not a color that you would make by mixing. You could mimic it by mixing, don't get me wrong. But because of that, it stays vibrant, and you can mix it with other colors and get some really interesting shadows and effects. I'm going to throw a little bit of my sap green in there because I'd already used that. And that's going to help me get that murky look because the sap green is a mix. And a little bit more ultramarine, I think. So we have just kind of a murky grayed teal. And that's a really nice watercolor, especially for New England where you have these icy waters in our rivers and ocean. And this is on the Stillwater River, and people actually do swim in it. When I was painting, a lady rode her bike over and hopped in.
It's a little too cold still, water is.
That water didn't feel bad. I was at a Sandy Point last weekend, and I hopped in, and I thought I was going to have a heart attack. It was such a shock to the system.
They've been putting on the weather app, they've had warnings, when it's been 80 or 85, warnings about people getting in the water, because water temps in a lot of places are still maybe 60 degrees.
Oh my gosh, I believe it. I was like, oh my word, this is not what I expected. And Kathy had mentioned, because she came to the beach too, and she had mentioned that the warnings on the weather apps, like, oh, I haven't seen that.
Lorraine Baldridge, I have hand finger paint. Is there something I can add to my paint brushes to help with the grip, or is there a brand of brush that you would recommend?
Royal and Langnickel has a brand called Soft Grip. Let me see if I have any. Oh, I got one right here. And what they have is a squishy, this squishy bit here to grab onto. You could also add pencil grips to any of your brushes, but if that's not enough, they do make chunkier pencil grips you can get at the office supply store or on Amazon that could help. And as far as brushes that have the chunkier handle, there are some adaptive ones made for toll painting, and then there's some even larger adaptive ones made for folks that have handicaps that have a hard time grasping, but you might not get the quality in the brush that you would want for watercolor. So I would look for finding some grips that you could add to the pencils the brushes you already have, since you probably already have decent ones. And that would be, you'd probably get a better brush at a lower price because the brush is already bought and paid for. You're just adding something on it to make it grippy. If you can't find anything to fit the bill, something I've done for my dad, because he has MS, is I have made weighted clay, like not brushes, he doesn't paint, but for pens, I've made like weighted clay pens. So just by using polymer clay, that will give you a little bit of weight to them, which might help if you're having strength issues on pushing the brush as much as you want to. That could help and help with balance of the brush. So there's some options, although I will tell you, if you have strength issues, working with polymer clay can be very difficult. If you have somebody that can help you with that, that would be the best. I have a hard time working with polymer clay because my hands are so cold. I can't condition it well enough. So just kind of keep that in mind and try one of those suggestions. Do you have any ideas? Because you've mentioned having some issues with colored pencils and stuff.
But I don't paint as much, so it's not a problem for me. And yeah, the polymer clay, or I know they make like rubbery grips for like pens and pencils, but I don't know if those would be wide enough. So I'm not sure. The polymer clay thing seems like it would be easiest if you could get somebody to
knead it for you.
Yeah.
That's even with the pasta machine. I have a hard time with it.
Yeah, when I did do clay, I don't do it anymore because of my hands. I would sit on it. Like I would put it underneath my thighs on a chair and just sit on it for a while, and that would help. Yeah,
I'll do it outside just because it's when it's warm. I wanted to have a little of that shadow behind this, but I also wanted to. I didn't want that harsh edge, so I just sprayed it and I enhanced. I can see this bloom that I didn't notice was there before. Right there. Huh, that's alright though. Looks cute.
Kathy Brenneman says that she puts rubber pipe covering on hers.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Because you can get it in different diameters, and they get you can buy them at Home Depot or Lowe's for cheap.
Oh, wonderful.
So
thanks,
maybe Kathy.
Yeah, maybe Kathy could mention if she has to adhere it, or how if it just slides on there, or if
it just slides on. You buy the diameter.
Oh wow, I didn't realize it came that small. I'd seen it larger, but that's a good hint. Oh, I love the community helping one another.
MKQ Pearson, the little watercolor kits that I bought for my son for school years ago did not smell bad. What is the odor like with more quality watercolors?
It really shouldn't smell. I've had some brands that have an odor, like the Marie's brand for some reason, and I don't know if they cut corners overseas sometimes, but I've had some like real cheap ones that had an awful odor to them, almost chemically smelling, like I don't know, just like if you go walk into an auto parts store, just kind of that smell to them sometimes. So I think it might be some cost-cutting additive they put in the paint, some sort of filler. But no, quality watercolors should not have any odor whatsoever. Okay, so for the water that I did behind the rocks, I just kind of spritzed it and let it fade away. And I'm going to give this a dry so that I can work on another layer on the rocks. So if any other questions come in, then it would be a great time to answer them. I love the questions coming in today too. Really, really good ones, really unique ones. If you see a big puddle start to form when you're hitting it with a heat gun, go ahead and blot at that excess water so you don't end up with back runs.
Alexandra Manga, how long does it take for the Mission Gold to dry in a half pan?
Mission Gold seems to take a while. So does the M Gram, and I found the core takes a little while to dry too. I think it's due to the humectant in it. Humectant, I guess, like either glycerin or honey, whatever they use to keep the paint from drying up super hard. So I would guess a couple days in like in New England anyway this time of year. I would even go maybe as far as a week.
Christine Renaud, I see you use your spray bottle. Do you use it as well, plein air?
I do. I didn't used to, but I brought it with me yesterday, and I really liked it, especially when you're sitting out in the sun and the wind can dry your paper and the sun can dry your paper. I love it just for fading out edges. And I like to have a one like this or one with a good size nozzle. The mini misters to me are a little... I don't have strength issues, but I find pumping the mini mister, it runs out quick and it is more difficult to grasp because it's so tiny. But yeah, I've started using it and I really, really like bringing it. I'm going to grab some burnt sienna and I'm going to add a little magenta to that to warm it up. So you notice none of my colors are super clean. I am using bright colors, but I'm letting them get kind of dirty on my palette and on my brush. I'm not always cleaning my brush in between because I'm still working on an object that is very neutral.
Heidi Wagner, how can I get M Gram to not be sticky on my paintings?
Use it thinner and use maybe a rougher paper. The only time I've had an issue with M Gram being sticky on a painting is when I used it on Yupo, and it was a fairly thick passage or concentrated color. It shouldn't stay sticky. Maybe it could also be that maybe when you squeezed it out, if you notice like a bunch of the binder coming out on its own, it could be that like maybe your paint separated before you put it in your palette in the tube. And that could lead to some sticky areas of your paint. But they use honey in there as a humectant, and it does stay moist, and it can stay sticky in your palette for quite a long time, especially if you live in a humid climate. I feel like this could use a little bit more of that teal color. I really think it's a nice contrast. Notice how I'm putting the color down. I'm not really painting on one thing specifically. I'm more just looking at where are there patches of cool, where are there patches of warm, where are there patches of dark, where are there patches of light. So I'm letting those dabs of color kind of define and build the shape of the rock. So when I put the cobalt teal in, I'm putting cooler passages, more shadowed passages, but not as dark as these dark gray mixes that I put in. It's more of a tone on the rock than it is the darkness of a shadow.
Christine, what is the difference on colors ending with hue?
Hue means that it's not using the traditional pigment, it's using a synthetic version. So if there's a pigment known to be one color, say cadmium red, and your color says cadmium red hue, that means instead of using cadmium, it's using the same color but made differently. So you'll get the same color, but it's not going to be the actual mineral that was originally used or the original pigment that was used, but the color will match. but it might not have the same opacity or granulating capabilities. So just kind of keep that in mind. You can definitely substitute with a hue, but you just might get a different effect as far as granulation or opacity. And any place I feel like I want to make it more pronounced, I'm adding the magenta. So I'm doing that on the kind of the points of the high points of the rock and the edges. And that's going to help it break away from the background, which is very cool. Now, an exercise you could do, if all this color is confusing or upsetting, you could use, like, especially if you buy paints in sets, which I do because if I know that I'm going to use half the colors, it's usually cheaper than buying just those few colors, and I can use the other stuff in classes or for specialty paintings. So you're probably going to have a Payne's gray or ivory black or neutral tint or something like that. You can use those colors and just take one tube, one color, square it out a little bit, make different concentrations of color by adding water, and do a picture in monochrome. And you can come up with some really good value studies that way. You can learn a lot, and you're using paint that probably would just sit unused in the tube. Now I'm using that mixed gray, and remember that was ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I mixed in a little more ultramarine blue, pardon me, and I am just adding some more streaks in the water, because your water will reflect all sorts of different colors and shadows, and it gives it some nice movement in contrast to our very stationary rocks. Don't put too much detail beyond the rocks though, because you want to have some, sharp focus at the rocks, but you don't want the background to be taken away too much of that spotlight. You can go up above the rocks a little bit, but don't go adding too much behind them. All right, I feel like I need some darker values, and I'm going to touch the rocks with the back of my hand and see if they feel cool. And if they feel cool, I'm going to proceed. I know that this part is still wet, so I wouldn't want to go right on top of that, but I can skip around to different parts of my painting. And when I'm painting, if I have plenty of time, like more than an hour, I'll have a couple sketchbooks going, so while something's drying, I can be working on something else. I'm going to mix up some more dark. I am going to use the burnt sienna and ultramarine, and I'm using my pointed round. So if you don't have a big round that comes to a point, just use a smaller one. That's fine. And I'm going to start working in the shadows of my picture. And I also want to let you know I'm painting from my painting. I'm not painting from my reference photo. So if you're going from the reference photo, it may be quite different. But that's okay. You go whichever one you like better. You paint from that. If you like the reference photo better, paint from that. If you like my rendition better, you can paint from that. You will not hurt my feelings.
No?
No. I am so offended that you didn't like my painting as much as you liked my reference photo. I'm just thrilled if you like either one. I don't care.
I mean, it's not like there aren't 10,000 other things to look at if you don't like that particular.
That's true, absolutely.
That's why I laugh when people get so offended or upset about something posted on the internet. I was like, there's only a billion other things to look at. You don't have to. So move on. Click it. Move on.
Yep. Some people just like to be offended, though, I think. I don't know how anyone can get offended by a craft tutorial, but people do. I don't know.
People get offended by everything.
You added too much to that painting. It's like, well, that's what I do, so... I'm not a minimalist painter. I add too many details and too many colors, or... I basically will skip around and look for where I feel like it needs a little bit more, like maybe if something's too big and boring, I will be like, okay, I need to add a darker shadow on top of this to show that there's like a little crack or a crevice or a cranny or something. And then if I see some place that I really like, I'll leave it alone. I'll leave it alone so that I don't spoil it. So if whatever I'm thinking about painting, if that doesn't add something interesting or make something else in the picture look more prominent, if it doesn't accent what I want to accent, then I generally won't add it. especially with rocks or tree bark or anything like that, you're better off to leave it out if you're not sure if you should be adding it, because your brain will fill in the gaps and will make up the difference. And I feel like I want a little bit of a purple passage in this orange area. I think that would look nice. And especially it shouldn't be too dark and magenta down there. So I'm adding a little bit of a gray that's got some purple into it. And so I just keep dipping from the mixes on my palette. And then everything has harmony because we keep mixing from the same colors we started off with our initial washes. I try to retain a little sparkle of white between the rock and the water. But if you missed it or you painted right up to the rocks, you can use a gel pen or a paint pen or some gouache on a fine tip brush to bring it back. I'm careful not to add outlines to the rock. I can always do that with a fine liner later if I want to, because the rocks get very sun bleached at the top and very dark at the bottom where the water splashes on top. So you want to kind of maintain that illusion of there being more weight at the bottom.
Lana Goes Art, what are the reds in the palette?
Pyrrole Scarlet and Quinacridone Magenta. But you just need a warm and a cool. You can do your favorites. And in fact, a lot of your cool reds, from different manufacturers might be the same pigment and be a different name. So, you might end up buying the same thing 2 or 3 times because you're buying it under different names from different manufacturers. And even from the same manufacturers, they could be using the same pigment in a couple colors, and they're so minutely different that you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But they might be milled just slightly different, or have slightly more binder or filler or something that makes them a little bit different. When I'm doing these cracks in the rocks, I'll load up my brush. I'll go in where I see a more definite shadow, and then as I'm running out of paint, I'll work my way around the picture to areas where I want a little bit of shadow, but not too much. That keeps me from having to stop and reload and wash my brush and waste paint. And it saves a lot of time. If I have too much detail somewhere, I'll just glaze over it with a lighter shadow and subdue it a little bit. I'm going to use some burnt sienna on its own, pretty much. I'm going to mix it into this area that's not totally clean, but I'm going to water it down so I end up with a kind of light brown glaze. And I'm adding bigger swaths of this. And I'm going to grab a little cobalt teal. So a lot of this is I'm just looking and seeing what feels right, what I feel like should be there as far as colors. But it's overlapping these strokes. Even if you're doing this in monochrome and you're just using shades of gray, it's overlapping those strokes and keeping it chunky that gives you that rock-like appearance. If you have your values right, you can paint this in monochrome purple or magenta, crazy colors. You just need to have your values right. I'm going to hit this with a heat tool because this feels cool to the touch, and then we're going to add a little more in the water.
Long Rose 2. I have problems finding the light source and where to put light shades on rock and cliff and finding colors to express such light and shaded parts. Do you have any tips?
My tip on learning the light for like a landscape would be to go outside and paint if you have access to, some nature where you could go out and paint, like a park or a just any place rural if you can get there. If not, try to find some lovely photography such as like National Geographic, because they will take landscape photos when it's very dynamic. So you'll have very strong light sources, such as sunset or sunrise, and those would be good to go by. So generally you'd want your sun a little low in the sky so you have more interesting lighting effects. But the light's coming from above generally, especially like in the middle of the day like it was here. So right next to objects you're going to have shadow, right underneath objects. But the best teacher is just to get out there in life and look at what you see, because then you can actually get up and move and see how, if the light changes or if the shadow changes when you're moving, which it shouldn't unless you have some object directly over you that's casting some shadow, or that's like casting shadow across your foreground that doesn't seem to be agreeing with everything else that's in your picture. But if that's not a possibility, good quality photographs like National Geographic on their website, that would be a good option. I'm going to go with another gray mixed with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Just throw a little bit more of that in the foreground water. I also want to have some plants kind of growing from around the rocks. That happens a lot. And I will grab a little burnt sienna there. I don't want it too watery because it needs to stand out. And I'm just going to like pick up some of the mixed gray that I made there. And I am going to just put a few little branches. I'll move my paper so my hand's not in the way. I'll pull out a few branches from here. I don't want to have whole branches because I'm going to be putting leaves, so I want to make sure that I don't like have a bunch of sticks. I want places for the leaves to go where, leaves will be in front of the branches. You wouldn't see like a straight branch and the leaves around it. And then I want to have a nice big one coming out from over here. This paper has a little more texture to it than the one I was painting on before, but I kind of like the effect I'm getting on there. Hopefully you can see it. And you can see how fine a line I can get with the tip of that big brush. So that's why I would just recommend getting that one brush rather than the whole set, because you really don't need it. And that's less stuff you have to carry when you're out painting. You can kind of see why that muted background works so well, because when we go and we put something on like this, because I hate painting around stuff and I don't like to use masking fluid, so this allows me to be able to paint something in front of a background, but it's still going to show up because everything is so muted back there. Okay, now I'm going to, I think I'll start with just some green gold on its own because I've already used that color, and dab in some leaves. And I like to do my colors and let them mix on the paper, especially if I've got something that I want to be fresh and bright. So I'm doing this green gold first. Whoops, that was sap green rather, sorry. Get my green gold. Just do it next to that sap green because I want them to kind of mix on the canvas. I don't want to mix them ahead of time, and that will give me a brighter effect. Because you generally will have really glowy, highlighted leaves at the top of trees or parts of the branches that stick out. So I want to get that effect. You could also spatter some on there, but there's a good chance you're going to get it beyond where you want it. Now I'm going to go in with a sap green. And I can overlap the edges of some of those leaves so that they can kind of blur together. And I can go next to some of them to make the brighter green stand out a little bit more. And I can use bigger I can push my brush down more and get a bigger leaf as I work my way down. And now I'm going to mix some ultramarine blue in with my sap green to get a darker shade. And you could use phthalo blue to get a darker shade, but we haven't used that anywhere, so it would be kind of out of place at this stage of the game to introduce it. We'll be going on to pen work in just a moment, so if you're painting along, you'll want to make sure you have a black pen. Since we're doing this as kind of a last stage, if your black pen is not waterproof, it doesn't really matter because you won't be doing watercolor over it. If you are using a waterproof pen, then you totally can do watercolor over it if you want to in the future. I feel like I want that a little bit brighter, so I'm going to go in with a little more of the green gold. And put a little guy over here as well. Make that a little bit, something growing over there. Now you can, especially if you want to grab some opaque color such as a yellow ochre, which tends to be a little bit more opaque, you could go in and throw little grasses kind of in between like a big crevice in your rocks. If you do the yellow ochre first, you can do green over it and it will show up. It won't be super vibrant, but it will show up even over that shadow. I'm going to do a final look for shadows with my watercolor, and then we're going to switch to the pen, and we're going to finish up our rocks.
Aaron Kimmel, have you used the Fluid brand paper? What did you think of it? The blocks are glued only on 2 sides.
I have. I only have the cheaper ones. I don't have the cotton. I only have the cellulose. But I think it's a good, student grade paper, or good, cellulose paper if you don't want to spend the money for the cotton. I actually just bought a 6-pack of the 140-pound sheets, 22 by 30 sheets, really cheap. It was like $12 at Jerry's. I'm not sure if the sale's still on or not, but I figured for making maybe some like accordion books to like do landscape painting, like long, wide landscape paintings, it would be kind of fun. But yeah, it's very similar to like a Cotman paper. I would say it's probably closest to a Cotman paper, or maybe Strathmore 400. It's not bad. Maybe not quite as good as Strathmore 400, but not bad. I'm not crazy about the glued on 2 sides thing. I got to tell you, that's kind of a gimmick, and I always leak my paint underneath to the next page. But maybe that's just me because I tend to go right out to the edge. But I think that's kind of a gimmick. I'm not crazy about that. But the paper itself, I think, is decent. Oh, I like that purple in there. I feel like the purple helped tie things together. Just using it really watered down, but just kind of on its own. I like that much better. So we're gonna do a final dry, and then we'll go to our pens.
Art Mystic, any tips for painting faster, or is it just more practice? I tried painting out at the lake, and the light changed so quickly that my light source was all over the place.
It's practice, and I would start with some time sketches. So if you have any cell phone will have like a little stopwatch timer on it, and I would set your timer for 30 seconds and just draw something for 30 seconds and do like 5 30-second quick sketches, and then go 2 minutes, and then 5 minutes, and then go sit out by the lake, and you'll feel like you have a day and a half when you have a half an hour.
All the time in the world.
All the time in the world. That's something that we do in the drawing course, Learn to Draw with Lindsay, is time sketches. And we start right off with that. Doesn't matter how your picture comes out, but it's going to get you used to not fretting and thinking about it too much and just jumping in and doing it. Alright, I think that's dry enough. Those top layers don't take quite as long. I'm just seeing what I have for pens handy here. I have a Sharpie, and it would be fine to use a Sharpie. The only thing that if you're using a sketchbook, if you use a Sharpie, it might bleed to the next page. So, I think that one will be fine. I've got a fine tip one that seems a little bit bigger than the small tip on the Pitt pens. So I like the Pitt pens because it's an India ink, So once it's dry, it's permanent, but it's not going to bleed through your paper, which is the big difference between like a Pitt pen or like a Copic marker or any other pen like that. I think I was using a medium point on my other sketch. I might actually, Sarah, there's a bag hanging up behind you. Yes, can you unzip that and grab my black pen that's in there?
Is it in the front pocket?
No, it's open zip the whole side thing, and it's right in the middle.
Oh, look at this snazzy thing.
I know, it's a Etcher slate bag. I've reviewed it. That video's going to air probably when I'm on vacation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, that's the medium point Pitt pen. I'm going to go with that. I don't use those extra fine ones and small nibs very often. I tend to prefer like the nib that a Sharpie would have, that more a little bit more bold, an ultra fine tip Sharpie that is. And I also find they last so much longer, because whenever I get the microns with the tiny tips, I felt like I would damage them, or they just wouldn't last that long. They would dry out a lot quicker, probably because they have a smaller tip. So I'm just going through and just kind of putting almost like dashes where I lost my branches when I put the green. So I'm just kind of doing some lost and found branches. So I'll start it at the base of the rock, but I'll make almost like dashes so I don't just make a bunch of like stick people trees. If you have an edge that's a little wonky, you can sharpen it up with your pens. You can have some branches extend beyond the leaves. You just want enough detail that somebody can tell that it's a bush growing out from the little clump of rocks. And then over here where you have grasses, you can go right ahead and draw the grasses, because they're not going to stand out as much as like those trees. And then you can go around any of the places where you've put shadow. You can go in and you can darken it. This pen's a little older, so I do need to go a little slower to get the ink to flow. So if I need to refill these, what I do is I use an India ink and I pull off the end and I just drip a few drops of India ink in there. And I use the Black Cat ink for that. It's very inexpensive. I don't use that in my fountain pens, but I got a big jug of it once when I was teaching kids classes, and I still have tons of it left over, and that works good for refilling these India ink pens. Not for Copic markers because it's not an alcohol ink, but it works great for the India ink pens. Now the key is not to get too fussy with this. You want to just go through and just kind of refine some of the lines and cracks in the rock so you don't get too fussy with it. But any place you feel like, boy, that should be a little bit sharper, that's what you do with the pen. You think of like how the sun's hitting it, you'd have those crevices that the light wouldn't catch. And any, like if you have an edge that got a little soft on you, you can go ahead and just kind of grab it. Sometimes an old pen is great for this because it's going to skip a little bit, and you're going to just naturally get those planes and those lost and found edges. It's almost like scribbling. It's very, very freeing and fun. So I hope everyone will feel inspired to try some rocks and not be intimidated by them. Try them in different colors. Try them with washes all one color if you want to. But that's just enough to give you that structure. You can also go in the water and you can add some ripples here, because when you get the water just being blown by a gentle breeze, you just get a little bit of a ripple there. Just keep your lines horizontal with the bottom edge of in parallel with the bottom edge of your paper. And if you didn't leave any sparkle, you can go into the white gel pen and you can add sparkle in. If your gap is a little too big, you can go back in with some watercolor, or you can kind of break it up with your pen a little bit. Like I think I'll probably dab in a little bit of watercolor there, a little bit of ultramarine blue, kind of grayed down, because I feel like I had a little too wide of a gap. You can always go back in later if you need to add a little watercolor, if you a little gel pen if you overdo it. But I think that's a good amount of sparkle. And I will dry this so you can see it dry. If anybody has any questions, then ask away before we're done. Oh, and Sarah, when you're done typing, can you hand me that blue sketchbook there? Because I'll show the other sketch I did on location before I did this one. Thank you.
You're welcome. That's a handy little organizer for any kind of art stuff.
Yeah, it's really neat. It's actually really chic looking. I think it'd be good if you like worked in a city and you took public transportation and you needed to look kind of fancy.
I like the Velcro.
Yeah.
You can put. Sorry, you're gonna do a review. I'll stop. I'm like, look at this. Cool.
Take it away, Vanna. I should have had you when I did the review. You could have demoed it.
I'm seeing it for the first time. What are my first thoughts?
Yeah, seriously. This is a sketch I did originally, and I have the tendency when I am sketching on location, because I usually don't have a lot of time, and I'm usually with my family, and I know they're going to be bored where we are, and they'll want to move along. I'll try to cram everything I can so I don't forget into a picture. So really, there was a lot more space between this bush and this tree. And that's the rock here that we just painted in detail. And I mean, like, I'm trying to see around the corner, down the river, where you can see kind of like grass over there and the river going around that bend. And I mean, I was putting so much in that before I knew it, I was so overwhelmed with the amount of green that they had here that nothing was dominant anymore. I wanted the rocks to be kind of the focal point, but the bush got too big and covered it up, and these trees kind of grew in, and I completely lost that. So that's why I decided to go in and then just focus on the rock and play with the colors and, you know, just have fun with that. So a lot of times I will have a couple sketches going so I can jump around and not get too overwhelmed. And then when I came back to sketch, I went down further down the park and looked down towards where the rocks were, and that's just the edge of that rock right there. That would be like that edge right there. And I was able to see down the river a little bit to a train bridge that was down pretty far away. I could barely make out what it was. So that's kind of the fun thing about sketching in location, is you get to get context. You can get up, move around, look and see what else is in your surroundings, and have fun with it that way. So
we had a request from Grace Blosser to show the jar and lemon, she said.
Oh, okay. In the front pocket, well, you lift up the front pocket and there's a pocket behind it, and that is in the...
Lift up the front pocket.
No, flip it over.
Ah, I didn't see that there was another pocket. Is this your mini sketchbook?
Yes, my mini sketchbook. Oh my gosh, I was going to add some white highlights, but my daughter had used my paint pens for one of her art projects, and I think she went over black with my white pen because it's looking very black. That was when I was sitting waiting for my lunch. I didn't want to get on my phone because I knew I'd feel guilty if I got on my phone and I looked at all the emails that I had and, you know, things. So I grabbed my sketchbook, and I've never done this before. I've never sketched in a cafe, and I decided I would sketch my water while I was waiting for my my dinner to arrive. So that was my little ball jar, because it's the one thing I love. It's mason jars and rocks. I could paint mason jars and rocks all day long.
Penny Cormier, can you show us how to reload Pit pens?
You know what? I think I probably can if I've got a jar of India ink handy. I do have a video on this, so just I'll see if I can get this cap off without pliers, and if so, if not, maybe a mod could find a link to that video and pop it in the chat. Oh yeah, I can't get that off without my pliers.
Not today.
Yeah, if somebody could find a
video.
I do. And well, I'm gonna grab a white gel pen. Actually, can you grab me that white gel pen that's in my bag? I should have set my bag over here.
I get that's fine. That's what you have me here for.
And this is a nice old white gel pen, so it's really skippy.
So it'll be super.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna hit some of the highlights. So that's another thing you can do. You don't have to use black. You can go in and get those edges with your white, especially when you have rocks. They catch the sun on a sunny day. They catch all those facets will catch the light, and if it's too bright, you can just kind of smudge it with your finger. If you have an edge that's getting kind of muddied like the edge where those plants are coming out, you can hit it with the white and then smudge it with your finger, because the plants might cast a shadow depending on where the sun is. You can also pull it away from the water if you're feeling like your rocks and your water got too samey. But a good old Skippy gel pen is great for this because it just gives you the lost and found edges. It's really good for shimmers on your water too, because it'll give you that little sparkly glimmer that water will have in the sunlight. So if you're local, Webster Park and Orono, plenty of parking. Well, not plenty of parking. I guess if a bunch of you showed up, you'd be out of luck. But, there's ample parking. And there is a porta potty, but I did not have to resort to that because I went out to lunch. That's nice. And apparently you can swim in it.
Karen Owens, I'm new to watercolor and have problems mixing colors and getting the same color twice. Any advice?
One thing that I recommend for beginners, I think once you get to a point where you've got color theory in your brain, you don't really have to rely on this, but start with a limited palette, so maybe like just those 6 colors, warm and cool version of your primaries, and do a color chart. So what you do is you make like a chart. You draw a chart like a grid. So if you have 6 colors, you would make a 6 by 6 chart, and you would paint. Say if it was bright red and bright red here, you'd mix them together. Obviously, you'd get red. But then the next one over would be bright red, and then maybe scarlet, and you mix those, and then with the green. So every color would get mixed with every other color, and you would get to see it. And they would actually end up mixed with every color twice, the way the chart works out. So you'd be able to see how you made every single color. And when you went back to make it again, you could look at your chart and say, okay, that was gamboge with scarlet. That's how I got that beautiful orange. Or you could say that was magenta with ultramarine. That's how I got that gorgeous purple. And it's a great way to learn your colors. I do go over color mixing and color theory in my essential tools and techniques for a watercolor class. And if you checked out my 15 cheap supply watercolor hacks video, there's a coupon that you can use on that class. So check that video out if you haven't seen it yet. Any other questions?
We're all caught up.
Wonderful. Well, guys, thank you so much for painting with me today. I hope you take some time this weekend to get outside and paint, even if it's just on your front porch. It is nice to be out in the fresh air painting. Like I said before, my watercolor floral workshop is on sale for about another week till the end of the month. So if you wanted to grab that for 50% off, you can, and you can take as long as you want to finish it. So it's always good if you know you want it to get it when the price is low. Anything you got to add, or?
I'm good. I don't have anything.
Okay, wonderful. All of the reference photos and whatnot are on my blog. And have a wonderful weekend. Until next time, happy crafting.